They say the mind is a fragile canvas where dreams and nightmares merge into a chaotic dance of reality and illusion. But what happens when the boundaries dissolve entirely, when terror seeps through the cracks of your consciousness? For Maya, this was the night she learned that some horrors refuse to stay within the confines of sleep. It began with the hum of the ceiling fan slicing through the silence of her dimly lit bedroom. The moonlight filtered through thin curtains, painting streaks of silver across the walls. It was a quiet night, the kind that invited rest. Exhaustion pulled Maya into the depths of sleep as she let the stillness embrace her. Hours passed before an unusual weight pressed down on her chest. At first, it felt like the remnants of a bad dream, but the sensation grew heavier, suffocating. She opened her eyes but found herself paralyzed. Her limbs wouldn't obey her commands, and the sheer helplessness began to smother her. The familiar surroundings of her room now felt alien, as if the very air had thickened with an unseen presence. Her eyes darted around, searching for answers in the dim light. That's when she noticed the corner near her desk. A shadow darker than the surrounding night seemed to move. At first, she dismissed it as her imagination, but her eyes adjusted, and the shape began to take form. It was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that twisted and bent at impossible angles. Its face, or the void where its face should have been, was darker than the deepest shadow, absorbing the faint light around it. The room grew colder as the figure stood motionless, an overwhelming force radiating from it. She wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but no sound came. Her gaze locked on the figure, unable to look away. Slowly, it began to move, each step deliberate, the silence amplifying her terror. It stopped at the foot of her bed, looming over her. Though featureless, it felt alive, its unseen eyes boring into her, stripping away every ounce of courage she had. The weight on her chest grew heavier, her breaths shallow and labored. The sensation was unbearable, as if her very soul was being crushed. Suddenly, the world around her shifted. The bed, the room, and the pale moonlight dissolved, leaving her suspended in a void. The air was thick with a metallic tang, and the silence was oppressive. The figure remained, growing larger, its shadow stretching endlessly into the blackness. As if on command, the ground beneath her formed, but it was no longer her bedroom. She found herself standing in an unfamiliar landscape, barren and desolate. The ground was damp, almost sticky, and a faint mist clung to her skin. The sky above was a swirling mass of dark clouds, illuminated by occasional flashes of crimson light. The figure was still there, towering and unyielding. It began to move again, its impossibly long limbs stretching with each step. The ground quaked beneath its weightless advance. Maya tried to run, to move, but her body remained rooted, as though the ground itself had trapped her. The shadows around her started to writhe. Shapes began emerging from the mist, humanoid but grotesque, their distorted forms flickering like dying flames. They surrounded her, their heads tilted as if studying her. Their presence was overwhelming, a chorus of inaudible whispers that filled her mind. The ground beneath her began to crumble. Maya looked down to find cracks forming, glowing with an eerie red light. Hands reached out from the fissures, gray and decayed, their long fingers clawing at her legs. She tried to scream again, her chest heaving with the effort, but no sound escaped. The figures surrounding her began to move in unison, their movements jerky and unnatural. The tall figure in the distance raised an arm, its gesture commanding the chaos. The whispers in her mind grew louder, each wordless sound burrowing into her thoughts. The weight of it all was unbearable, a crescendo of terror that threatened to break her completely. Just when the pressure seemed too much, she was pulled back. Her bedroom returned in an instant, the moonlight once again painting soft streaks across the walls. The air felt lighter, and her chest heaved as she sucked in desperate breaths. She sat up, clutching the blanket tightly, her body trembling with residual fear. Her gaze darted around the room, searching for anything out of place. Everything seemed normal. The desk, the armchair, the curtains gently swaying. Yet the corner where the figure had appeared seemed darker, the shadow there deeper than it should have been. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, her bare feet touching the cool floor. Her heart pounded in her chest as she reached for the lamp. The soft glow illuminated the room, but it did little to ease her racing thoughts. The journal on her bedside table caught her attention, its cover slightly ajar. She hesitated before picking it up, her hands trembling as she flipped through the pages. The entry she had written the night before stared back at her, the bold letters of her challenge mocking her. "If you are real, show me." Her breath hitched as she noticed a new line written below it in spidery handwriting she didn't recognize. "The door remains open." The lamp flickered, plunging the room into darkness for a split second. Her heart seized, her gaze snapping to the corner of the room. The shadow there seemed to swell, stretching outward, creeping toward her. The room was silent, but her mind was anything but. The figure was gone, but the heaviness remained. The shadows were no longer just shadows, and the silence felt alive. Maya sat frozen, the journal still clutched in her hands. Sleep was no longer an escape, and her room no longer felt like a sanctuary. She had opened a door, one she could not close, and in the depths of the dark corner, the shadows waited. There is a silence in the dead of night that feels heavier than any sound. For Sarah, it was supposed to be just another evening. Long hours at the office, followed by the short walk back to her small, cozy apartment. She had always found comfort in her nightly routines. But tonight, something was different. As soon as she stepped through the door, she felt it. A stillness too deep, as if the air itself had stopped moving. Shaking off the unease, she told herself she was just tired. She had worked overtime again, and her mind was playing tricks on her. She changed into her favorite pajamas, made herself a cup of herbal tea, and crawled under her quilt. Her bedside lamp glowed softly, casting a warm light on the walls. As she closed her eyes, the tension in her body began to ease. The soft light of her bedside lamp lit up the room in a warm glow. She started feeling peace, while her body relaxed into the bed, and sleep began to take over. But something felt strange. At first, it was just a faint feeling, like the air had grown heavier. She shifted slightly, thinking it was nothing. Then the weight increased, pressing against her chest. Breathing felt harder, as if something invisible was holding her down. Her eyes opened, wide and alert. The room looked the same. The lamp was still on, her curtains were still drawn, and everything was as it should be. Yet something felt deeply wrong. When Sarah tried to move, she couldn't. Her arms and legs wouldn't respond. She was frozen in place, her body completely stiff. Panic rose in her chest. She wanted to call for help, but no sound came out. Her voice, like her body, was trapped. Then she heard it. It started as a faint sound, like someone whispering far away. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but the whispers grew louder. They seemed to come from every corner of the room, filling the air with strange, unintelligible words. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for the source. That's when she noticed the shadows. The once still shadows on the walls and ceiling began to move. They twisted and stretched, shifting as though alive. Slowly, they pooled together in the corner of her room, forming a dark shape. The shape grew taller, its limbs long and thin, and its movements unnatural. It looked like a person, but wasn't one. It had no face, just a black void where its features should have been. Despite this, Sarah felt it watching her, its gaze cold and unrelenting. Fear gripped her. She couldn't scream or move. She could only watch as the figure began to drift closer, gliding silently across the room. It didn't walk. It floated, defying everything that should have been possible. The whispers became louder, echoing inside her head, making it hard to think. The figure stopped at the edge of her bed, looming over her. The air grew colder, so cold that she could see her breath forming in tiny white clouds. Sarah's mind was racing. She couldn't understand what was happening. Her heart pounded in her chest as if it was trying to escape. The figure didn't touch her, but its presence felt suffocating. The darkness around it seemed to grow, swallowing the light from her lamp. And then, everything went silent. The whispers stopped, and the room was eerily still. Sarah blinked, her body trembling. For a brief moment, she thought it might all be over. But then the figure moved again. It didn't reach for her. Instead, it seemed to dissolve, turning into a cloud of darkness. The shadows wrapped around her, pulling her into their cold, empty embrace. Sarah's vision blurred, and she felt herself falling, though she didn't know where. When her surroundings came into focus again, she wasn't in her room. She was standing outside her grandmother's old house, a place she hadn't seen in years. It looked the same as she remembered, dark, quiet, and slightly decayed. Memories began flooding back, sharp and clear. She remembered spending time here as a child, the way the wooden floors creaked, the smell of old books in the study. But other memories followed, one she had tried to forget. She remembered shadows in the corners of the house, whispers that would start late at night, and the cold, heavy feeling that something was watching her. Her gaze fell on the study window. A chill ran down her spine as she recalled the door hidden behind the tapestry in that room. It had always been locked, but one day, curiosity had gotten the better of her. She had opened it. What she saw beyond that door had scared her so much that she had never gone near it again. The memory was fuzzy, as though her mind had blocked out the worst parts. But now, standing here, she couldn't escape it. The front door creaked open, its hinges groaning as though inviting her inside. The house seemed to breathe, alive with the same oppressive silence she had felt in her apartment. Her legs felt heavy, but they moved on their own, carrying her toward the open door. She stepped inside, the air cold and stale. The whispers started again, faint but growing louder with each step. The house hadn't changed. The furniture was covered in dust, and the floor creaked beneath her weight. But the shadows, those were alive, moving along the walls and ceiling. They seemed to guide her, pulling her toward the study. The tapestry still hung in its place, hiding the door. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached out and pulled the fabric aside. The door was there, just as she remembered, its surface carved with strange symbols. Her heart raced as she placed her hand on the handle. She didn't want to open it, but she felt as though she had no choice. The whispers became a roar, urging her forward. As the door swung open, darkness spilled out, thick and heavy. It wrapped around her, pulling her into its depths. The last thing she saw was the void beyond the door, filled with pulsing, shadowy figures. When Sarah woke up, she was back in her apartment. The lamp was on, her quilt pulled up to her chest, and the room was still. Yet, the corner of the room where the shadows had gathered was darker than it should have been. Sarah didn't sleep again that night. Some places and some memories should stay buried. Dylan had always been the sort to dismiss supernatural things. Ghost stories, haunted houses, urban legends, they were, in his eyes, products of overactive imaginations or clever tricks to scare the gullible. But he had never experienced anything he couldn't rationalize. That is, until one fateful night changed everything he thought he knew. It began on a quiet Friday evening. Dylan had spent hours scrolling through his phone, mindlessly flicking between social media and videos. The warm glow of the screen filled his room, the only source of light as the night deepened. Exhaustion eventually overtook him, and he set the phone down, letting sleep claim him. Yet his slumber was far from peaceful. His dreams were fragmented, vivid flashes of shadowy figures and endless corridors that seemed to stretch on forever. It wasn't long before he was jolted awake, or so he believed. His eyes fluttered open to the dim light of his bedside lamp, its faint glow casting long, eerie shadows across his room. But something was wrong. He couldn't move. No matter how hard he tried, his limbs remained pinned to the mattress. Panic surged as he realized he wasn't in control of his own body. The air around him grew thick, almost suffocating, as a heavy chill settled over the room. From the corner of his eye, Dylan caught a glimpse of the mirror across from his bed. It was a large antique piece he had inherited from his grandmother, and it stood like a silent sentinel in his room. His heart sank as he noticed something unnatural. His reflection wasn't mimicking his frozen state, it was moving. At first, the movements were subtle, a shift of the shoulders, a tilt of the head, but they soon grew bolder. His reflection sat upright, staring directly at him. Its eyes were wide, unnaturally bright, and filled with an intensity that sent shivers down his spine. Then it smiled. The expression was wrong, too wide, and entirely alien to Dylan's face. It was a grin filled with malice, a silent declaration of dominance. The reflection began to move more deliberately, swinging its legs off the bed and standing up. Dylan, still paralyzed, could only watch in growing terror. The reflection walked closer to the mirror's surface, its steps deliberate and measured. As it approached, faint cracks began to form on the glass, spreading like veins. The room seemed to hum with an unnatural energy, the air charged with something he couldn't explain. Dylan's mind raced. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped his throat. He tried to look away, but his gaze was locked on the unfolding nightmare. The cracks in the mirror deepened, and the reflection leaned closer, pressing its distorted face against the fractured surface. It was as if it were testing the boundaries of its prison. Then, with a sharp, deafening crack, the mirror shattered. But instead of shards falling to the floor, they hung suspended in the air, floating like fragments of some broken reality. The reflection didn't shatter with the glass. It remained whole, stepping through the frame as though it were nothing more than a doorway. The temperature in the room plummeted, and the oppressive weight on Dylan's chest intensified. The reflection stood at the foot of his bed, tilting its head as it observed him. It raised a hand and gestured toward him, as if inviting him to join it. Dylan's vision blurred as the weight on his body shifted, not just pinning him down but pulling at him. It felt as though something was trying to drag him out of his own skin. Suddenly, the room began to distort. The walls warped, stretching and twisting like something out of a fever dream. The shadows cast by his bedside lamp moved independently, growing larger and more menacing. Dylan's sense of reality began to crumble. He couldn't tell if he was awake or trapped in some terrible nightmare. Just as his mind began to spiral into despair, the reflection stepped back toward the broken mirror. It reached out to touch one of the floating shards, and the room stilled. The oppressive weight lifted, and Dylan gasped for air. He could move again. But as relief washed over him, he noticed something chilling. The reflection wasn't retreating. It was drawing something out of the mirror. From the fractured glass emerged shadowy figures, their forms fluid and ever-changing. They swirled around the reflection like wraiths, their presence amplifying the cold and dread that filled the room. The reflection turned back to Dylan, its twisted grin returning. The shadowy figures followed its gaze, and he felt their collective malice directed at him. Then, without warning, they lunged. Dylan braced himself for impact, but the shadows passed through him, not attacking but invading. His vision darkened as an unbearable cold seeped into his very being. It felt as though they were searching, probing, trying to find something within him. When the shadows finally withdrew, the room was eerily silent. The reflection and its wraith-like companions were gone, leaving the mirror intact as though nothing had happened. But Dylan knew better. He sat up, trembling, and looked at his reflection. It seemed normal, mimicking his movements as it should. Yet something felt off. He couldn't shake the sensation that he was no longer alone in his own body. The days that followed were a blur of unease. Dylan avoided mirrors, his paranoia growing with each passing moment. Shadows seemed to linger longer than they should, and he often felt an unseen presence watching him. Then, one night, as he passed by the mirror, he saw it again. The twisted grin, the two bright eyes. It was waiting, biding its time. Dylan never told anyone about what he experienced. He moved the mirror to the attic, locking it away. But deep down, he knew it wasn't over. The reflection wasn't just a figment of his imagination. It was something far worse, and it had found a way into his world. And one day, it would return to finish what it started. The night was calm, with the faint hum of crickets singing outside the window. For Mia, it was supposed to be just another peaceful sleep after a long day. The warmth of her blanket, the stillness of her room, and the comfort of her pillow seemed like the perfect recipe for rest. But the darkness that visited her that night would haunt her forever. Mia's consciousness stirred slowly, trapped in the uncomfortable space between sleep and wakefulness. Her eyes fluttered open, drawn to the faint glow of her digital clock on the bedside table. The time read 3:07 a.m. Something felt off. Her body was heavy, her limbs cemented to the bed as though unseen chains had bound her. She blinked, her breath quickening. Her chest tightened with an unbearable weight. She tried to move her fingers, her toes, anything, but they refused to respond. Panic bubbled up inside her as she realized she was trapped in her own body. The room was silent, unnaturally so, and even the distant hum of crickets had vanished. Then, a sound broke through the stillness. It was faint at first, like a faint rasping, almost imperceptible. Her ears strained to make sense of it, and then it came again, closer this time. Deliberate and deep, like someone dragging a heavy, sharp object across the floor. Her eyes darted toward the end of her bed, where shadows seemed to thicken unnaturally. Slowly, they began to shift and twist, pooling into a shape, a figure crouching low to the ground. Its body was long and gaunt, its limbs impossibly thin, like skeletal branches twisted into grotesque angles. Its head cocked unnaturally to one side, and though its face was shrouded in darkness, she could feel its gaze. The air grew colder as the figure moved, crawling on all fours, its bony hands scraping across the floor with agonizing slowness. It climbed onto the foot of her bed, its weight imperceptible but its presence suffocating. The bed creaked softly under the invisible strain, and Mia's heart raced wildly in her chest. It loomed closer, inching up her body, until it hovered above her. She could feel its breath, cold and foul, brushing against her face. Its head lowered, its shadowy features just inches from hers. A low growl rumbled from deep within it, vibrating through her very core. Mia's eyes darted desperately around the room, looking for a way to escape, but there was nothing, only the unending darkness and the oppressive presence of the creature. The more she fought, the heavier her body felt, as though the weight of the thing was seeping into her very soul. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The weight on her chest vanished, her body jolted awake, and she gasped for air as though she had been drowning. Her heart thundered in her ears, and her room seemed to return to normal. But as she sat up, trembling and drenched in sweat, something caught her attention. The foot of the bed. There were deep, jagged claw marks embedded into the wood. Mia never spoke of that night to anyone, but she knew the truth. Sometimes, the things we see during sleep paralysis aren't just figments of our imagination. Sometimes, they're watching, waiting for their chance to get closer. If these sleep paralysis stories gave you chills, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more terrifying tales. Hit the bell so you never miss an update. Sleep tight, or maybe don't.